and Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This week's guest is Peter Boghossian. His new book is How to Have Impossible Conversations, a very practical guide indeed. It is. I really enjoyed the book. It's a very kind of outline-ish, point-by-point, very useful practical guide for and not just debating God or politics or whatever, but just for talking to anybody. So a lot of what I've been doing for the last 25 years, I've kind of stumbled along, and maybe that's a third of the points in the book, and the rest was new. So really helpful on that. We get into that. We talk about atheism and secularism, politics, social media, and all this rather intractable platforms where it's very difficult to have a conversation. So if you enjoyed the podcast, please give us some support at skeptic.com/donate or at Patreon. Thank you. And here is Peter Boghossian. Welcome to the podcast, Pete, and congratulations on the new book. It is How to Have Impossible Conversations, a very practical guide. Indeed. In fact, I was really happy to read this because a lot of the stuff is things I've kind of developed by accident, just by trial and error in terms of engaging people from creationists and Holocaust deniers to psychics and 9/11 truthers and all that. And so it's nice to have, in one package, like here's how to do it. And here's the research showing why this works and that doesn't work. Some of which I kind of figured out on my own, a lot of which I didn't know, and gave me a lot of good stuff to try out. And I love the opening story about, hang on. It's, conversing with an asshole. And I'm reading this going, who is this asshole? And it turned out it's you.
That's right.
So it's kind of nice that you're self-deprecating in the sense of admitting, that any of us can be an asshole. In fact, I'm sure we all have been. I know I have.
Yeah, I've made a lot of mistakes over the years. But first, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. The book is my life's work, and it picks up from nobody had synthesized up to this point diverse bodies of literature and taken what works in hostage negotiation and everything from applied epistemology and psychology, drug and alcohol treatment counseling, cult exiting, hostage negotiation. So it's all there. And I was really motivated to do this book by Donald Trump and what I saw happening in the society and how we've lost friendships. We don't know how to speak across divides. And it's the exact opposite thing is being modeled for us on college campuses. So hopefully this is going to make a contribution to that.
Yeah, there's stories about people getting divorced over Trump.
Right.
I mean, that's crazy. I mean, politics is important, but it's not that important giving up spouses and friends. But a lot of people have.
Yeah, and I think that's a lesson from the book as well. Is let people be wrong. Excuse me. And too often we just, I don't know. I mean, is it me or is this a more recent phenomenon that we're not willing to let things go or let things slide, or we viciously attack people who share the vast majority of our beliefs but have some ideological deviation? I think Freud said that about when people look differently than you. If they look just a little differently, you dislike them more. But I think this recently there really is a crisis of communication and people aren't talking to each other. And I think part of it is because they don't know how, because what they're getting modeled for them in the universities is they never hear this, they never hear the other side, like Lindsay Shepherd, or they're never even allowed to voice an opinion that's divergent. And then the consequence of that is other people don't hear that.
Yeah. I think it is worse from what I've seen from some research on this in terms of the polarization of the left and the right. That is, the number of people that self-identify as far left and far right have grown. The people that have self-identified as being centrists have shrunk. That middle portion has shrunk. They've gone to the two extremes. Jared Diamond has a discussion in his new book, Upheaval. I had him on the podcast, and he was talking about the time that congressmen spend with each other, with the opposite party members, has shrunk since the 90s. There's people that measure this sort of thing, like how much time does a congressman spend in Washington, D.C. versus at home? And they're spending far more time at home now fundraising, for example, because there's so much money in politics now that they have to raise money. So basically, they just work Monday through Friday. They leave early Friday. They go home and maybe have a long weekend. And they don't have lunches with people in the other party. They don't go to the softball game with their kids, with people of the other party. They spend less time. And in part, I think, this is my own opinion on this, is in part polarized by conservative talk radio and television. It's not, these people are not just different in their opinions. Of course, we expect that. Democrats and Republicans are two different parties with two different platforms, so you would expect them to be different, but they're not just different, they're wrong. And they're not just wrong, they're immorally wrong. They're evilly wrong. Right.
And as Lindsay and Pluckrose have said, they represent an existential threat. So in Plato's Republic, or in the Theaetetus, he talks about, so just taking one step back. So Plato wrote, and Socrates was a character in those dialogues. And he talked about how people don't knowingly do or believe bad things. It's just that they're lacking a piece of information. And if they just had all of the information, they wouldn't believe what they do. And I think that's a very helpful, to a certain extent, it's a helpful heuristic to think about it. But the problem is that we trap ourselves into thinking, oh, well, if Ken Ham just had this piece of information, he wouldn't be in the epistemological mess he's in. Well, it's not true. It actually doesn't work like that. It's not like you can just give someone a particular piece of data and that would change their mind. But I do think that people look at other people now, not that there's an epistemological problem, that is how they conceptualize problems, but they look at people on the other side as bad people. And once you do that, it's even more difficult to have those conversations across divides.
Yeah, Dan Kahan just published some research last year showing that there's almost no correlation between knowledge of climate science and your position on, global warming. You think it's real or you think it's a hoax. What did correlate it with is party affiliation. Yeah, in the ways we all know. And so there, when people signal particularly on social media, their opinion on climate change, they usually know nothing about it. And even if they do, it's irrelevant. Basically, they're signaling to their fellow party members or their tribe, I'm such a good, reliable tribal member, I doubt climate change. Right. I'm willing to say I think it's a Chinese hoax. That's how crazy left or far right or whatever your position is, I am.
So we talk a little bit about that in the book. It's a variation of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is, again, when you're so ignorant, you don't understand your own ignorance. And it comes from the idea that when two men robbed a bank and they put lemon juice on their face, and they were astonished. They were incredulous that the cameras picked them up. The researchers had the insight that they were too stupid to know that they were too stupid to rob a bank. But there's something we talk about in the book. It's called the unread library effect, in which in the late 90s, early 2000s, researchers looked at, they asked people questions about the inner workings of toilets. And they found that most people thought that they could describe in detail how a toilet works, or they understood the mechanisms of toilets. But when they actually asked them to do that, and then post-tested them numerically to rate their knowledge of how toilets work, they were much lower. And subsequently, they found that effect can moderate political beliefs. So in conversations, we found in my own interactions with people, that's borne out by the literature, you just have to ask as many details as possible. Like, oh, you're for mass deportations, which is something, unfortunately, we're hearing from the Trump administration right now. Well, who would pay for that? How would that work? What would that look like? Tell me the logistics of that. Where would they be stored? How would they? And you'll find that the more details you ask people, it exposes that effect. And the idea is that because somebody knows it, it's the cousin to Dunning-Kruger effect, because somebody knows it, I must know it. Like, that information is out there and it's kind of seeped down to me. So just from asking details about that, it can expose that effect. The problem, though, is, as Jonathan Haidt and others have talked about, Haidt in The Righteous Mind, is that morality binds and blinds. And so the moment people think that they're better people for having a particular belief, it's either they think it's a moral reason or it has an identity level salience. So the moment that happens, it becomes more difficult for people to revise their beliefs, and those conversations become more difficult.
Yeah, our next issue of Skeptic is the cover story by Steve Pinker, and are we living in a post-truth world? He says we're not. It actually opens up with the question, is the statement we're living in a post-truth world true?
Right.
Of course, if it's true, then it can't be true. Anyway, but he points out there that of the many tools we can apply to show how reason can work is to simply ask somebody to articulate what it is they think, say, NAFTA is. Somebody goes, I'm against NAFTA. Or, well, what is NAFTA? I don't know. It's like most of us don't really know the details of climate science and trade agreements and tariffs and things like that. So one tool is just please tell me what you think it is. Now, I don't know how to do that without sounding like you're challenging somebody's intelligence.
So in the book, we talk about that. So people will have very well rehearsed, they'll have very well rehearsed defenses of a conclusion, but very poorly rehearsed defenses of an epistemology. And that was my first book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, that honed in on somebody's epistemology, asking people how they know what they know. And subsequent to that, and this is, again, the book is very well researched and it's also based upon my experience. I now have changed that and I immediately start those questions with the goal of being not to invoke a defensive posture so someone doesn't become defensive. And I published a piece in Skeptic about this, is immediately ask a disconfirmation question. In philosophy, you call it defeasibility. So a disconfirmation question echoing Popper would be, oh, okay, well, how could that belief be wrong? So someone believes, whatever they believe, federal government should crack down on marijuana, federal government shouldn't crack down, doesn't matter what it is. You front load the question. So there are all these little templates in the book. So one is that Rappaport's rules, you listen, you understand, you repeat it back to them, and then I immediately hit them with a disconfirmation question. Don't question the conclusion at all. How could that belief be wrong? So when you do that, not only it offers people an opportunity to reflect on their beliefs, because usually people challenge a conclusion they have or they bring a counterexample. And here's a heresy for you. I no longer ask people for evidence for their beliefs. Because I've found that when people tell you the evidence for their beliefs and then they listen to themselves telling you the evidence for their beliefs, it becomes more difficult to instill doubt and dislodge those beliefs. So
why is that?
Instead of asking for any evidence, I immediately ask for a disconfirmation question.
Yeah, I think the way you phrased it was, what would it take to change your mind?
That's
something
right.
like that, right?
Yeah.
So you're not threatening them or challenging their intelligence or anything like that. You're just, if you got to ask it the right way though. Like you're not being an asshole. You're just curious.
You're asking them. Well, so that's the template again. The first template is, you build rapport, you ask questions, whatever basic questions. And for that, not, what do you do? Because most people they don't like to talk about what they do but what do you do when you're not working? So then you could, that's a good rapport building question. And then when you find a topic or an idea, you just ask them, you want to do, and Dennett talks about this in Intuition Plums, you want to ask them in such a way that they say, yeah, I wish I could have expressed it that clearly. In hostage negotiations, the goal is to get them to say, that's right. So when you get to say, that's right, you know that you've articulated that back to them. And then, again, just to save myself time, immediate disconfirmation questions. Oh, that's really interesting. Not your belief, right? How could no, there's no you in this. It's just that belief. How could that idea be wrong? Like what evidence, and I'm not saying I have that evidence, I'm just curious, what evidence could you be presented with that would cause you to revise that belief?
Yeah, I sort of see this book as a sequel to your previous book. I like the street epistemologist concept, which is yours, I think, that you just in kind of a Socratic method, you just ask a lot of questions. Like, I'm just curious, how did you come to this belief, or that kind of thing. I think of you as sort of a Columbo. Remember that television series, Columbo? That's right. Yeah. That's right. Excuse me. I just have one more question. just one last little thing has kind of been bothering me.
Right.
Before you know it, the guy's confessing to the crime. Yeah.
And the other thing is, it's remarkably easy to do this. It's not a Jedi mind trick. It's not. And people would say to me, "Oh, don't you think this is unethical?" Or I don't see. It's like I was thinking about the thing that you said to me about senators not speaking with each other. I don't see how it would be unethical to talk to somebody and help them realize that they don't know what they think that they know. And as long as you are also open to the fact that you could be mistaken, we could all be mistaken about something.
Yeah.
Just as an aside, I was approached by a Christian university. I was in conversation with Christians about teaching at their university. And one of the things that they said to me is the reason that I'm not qualified is unless I wanted to sign a statement of faith. Mm. And I said, not only could I not sign a statement of faith, but I could also not sign a statement of unfaith. Mm. And the reason for that is that I would have to be willing to revise my belief if sufficient evidence came along the way. So if I were convinced of some argument, ontological, whatever the cosmological, whatever the argument would be, I couldn't even sign a statement of non-belief. And I think that there's something key in that idea of the being willing to revise your belief. You know, that's the American Philosophical Association's Delphi report on the ideal critical thinker. And so helping people to be more humble and critically think about what they believe and giving people the tools, because I don't think these things are systemic in terms of top down. I don't think you can legislate these things. But I think if we have enough people asking the right questions, we can re-inject civility into our discourse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's go through your beginner level. We'll go beginner, intermediate, advanced,
let's do it.
And then super advanced. So 9 ways to start changing minds. Now, the presumption is you're talking to somebody who is in disagreement with you about some particular issue. You're pro-life, I'm pro-choice, or whatever, and we're gonna talk that through. So you go through this modeling words, ask questions, acknowledge extremists, navigating social media, don't blame, do discuss, focus on epistemology, learn, and what not to do. So let's start modeling. What does that mean?
You're asking me to give away the whole book. Okay,
just give us a few bullet points.
I'll give you the whole thing. So you want to model the behavior you want to see in others. Here's a great trick from that section. I don't really like to think in terms of tricks, but this is a great trick. Let's say you're having a conversation with someone and they simply refuse to answer the question you're asking. Just say to them, could you please ask me the same question?
Ooh.
And they say, what? And say, no, just ask me that. And I had that when I was speaking with someone who in Australia, a Muslim community leader who believed that women should be stoned to death for adultery. And I kept asking them the question, and they kept obfuscating. And I said, well, just ask me the question. So finally, this individual said, do you think women should be stoned for adultery? And I said, no. Do you think women should be stoned for adultery? And he said, yes. So it's a modeling behavior that you can use. That's one. You mentioned calling out extremists on your side. That's a great little technique that you can use. So just identify some extremists who are on your side and then just call them out. And what that does is most people know more about the extremists on the other side than they do the other side. So they know more about Islamic extremists, whereas they couldn't possibly tell you the first thing about the difference between Shia and Sunni Islam, right? So among that, the succession of Prophet Muhammad. But the idea is that they're so familiar with the crazies on the other side, and it's a really good way to build some conversational and even moral currency by criticizing your own extremists.
Yeah. How do you determine when's the right time to have these kinds of conversations? You know, at the dinner table or at the ball game or you know, you're sitting down at a dinner party or something, and, you know, do you bring it up or not?
That's a good question. It depends. In the book, we write about goals. You have to figure out what your goals are. Sometimes you may just want to wait until your approach and then practice some techniques. Sometimes you're more or less held hostage by the situation. So you're at a Thanksgiving or a family dinner and you just can't get away, or you're with an obnoxious uncle. So if you know, that's from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You begin with the end in mind and then you work back. So you figure out what you want your goal to be and then you adapt accordingly. So maybe you just want to just get through the meal. So you just, you know, say, okay, my goal is to get through the meal and to not have anybody become incendiary and not have, you know, the turkey thrown around the room. And so, you know, you just listen, and the book offers templates for exact questions to ask.
Yeah, I remember when after Dawkins' The God Delusion came out in 2006, the atheist community got somewhat divided over how militant should we be. And, you know, him and Hitch in particular were, you know, the sort of pit bulls of the movement. And, you know, they had a lot of people saying, yeah, that's what we should all do that, you know, like make fun of these people for being delusional. Right. And that'll really turn it around. And my feeling was, I don't think so. I mean, if you tell somebody they're deluded, you know, that, you know, the wall goes up, they're not listening to you anymore. It just pisses them off. And so maybe a softer approach works. Well, but then, of course, Dawkins has lots of letters saying, you know, I read your book, I changed my mind, I'm now an atheist. You know, I remember when he was on Bill O'Reilly's show, And, and O'Reilly says, how do you know your approach works? He says, I have thousands of letters. And Bill O'Reilly goes, I have tens of thousands of letters. So,
Right.
we can't just count up letters, I guess. But, how do you know what's the right approach for those kinds of controversial issues?
So I'll throw this out. I'll divide it into micro and macro. On the macro level, it does seem that possibly the calling people out on the delusion thing would work, the Bill Maher approach, the Dawkins approach, the Hitchens approach. But on the micro level, there's simply no evidence for that. In fact, most of the evidence is against that. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions to that, like, Penn Jillette's some famous example of working with Hasidic Jews, et cetera, tells the story of the hamburger. But
I don't know that story. What did Penn do?
Oh, you should actually get it from him. I think I heard it, and then we did a podcast together, or we did an event in Vegas, and he was telling me about it. But basically, he called somebody out. I shouldn't tell this.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's all right. I'll ask Ben about that.
Yeah. So I think that the idea is, I don't think there's any one approach. I think the tent is big enough. But in micro interactions, one-on-one, calling people, there's just no evidence that it works.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my answer to the question is, it depends. There's not one right answer. Sometimes humor works, sometimes assertiveness works, sometimes softness works.
Yeah, and do you really want to be that guy who's a dick?
No.
Do you really want to be that guy who, want to talk to Shermer? He's just an asshole. No, I mean, you want to, I would think it would be more beneficial if people perceived you as someone with whom they could speak honestly and openly, rather than someone who's going to call them an idiot and delusional and a creatard, et cetera. And I don't think I've ever given anybody that.
A little bit, a few years after this whole affair started in 2006, at TAM, the amazing meeting, Phil Plait gave a lecture called that by that title, "Don't Be a Dick." And it was just so obviously true, but unbelievably, it was controversial. Like, that's controversial.
Right.
There's a lot of people in the skeptics movement, along with the atheist movement, that they're angry about the effects of people having delusional beliefs. Flying planes into buildings or blowing up abortion clinics or whatever. We got to fight back aggressively.
See, I think that's one of the reasons that caused the schism and the downfall of the whole thing. I think the part of the schism was people like me. I'm not gay, I'm straight, I'm not a minority really of any kind. I'll bracket that a little bit, but for the most part, I'm not. I never felt any injustice personally. I just thought the whole thing was ridiculous and silly. And so many people, however, who did feel acute injustices more or less rose up to the social justice side of atheism and skepticism. And I think that was one of the things that caused the divisions, including atheism plus, and this idea that you can't just have no belief, you have to have positive values that go with that. But
the atheist plus movement was not good for the overall big tent approach. We are already small in number as it is. To give people a list of, like, these are the dozen things you have to believe politically and culturally and socially, and if you don't, you're not one of us. Oh boy, big mistake. The humanist movement kind of did that in the 70s and 80s, and I remember thinking, well, I'm kind of a libertarian, classical liberal. I tick maybe half the boxes or 3/4 of the boxes, but the couple over here, am I in or am I not in?
Right. Every time you add a conjunction to that, something and something, you just diminish your pool. But even beyond diminishing your pool, those values, while they may be rationally derivable, they have nothing to do with not collecting stamps. Like, if you're an atheist, there is no, someone just the other day said, well, what's the atheist worldview? There is no atheist worldview.
Right. I was tweeting about that.
Oh,
yeah, because, I've been saying this for forever, is that, what do you atheists believe? Okay, just drop, that's the wrong question. What do secular humanists believe? What do people who believe in civil rights believe, or whatever? You have to define yourself by what you do believe, not by what you don't believe. But, that meme, atheists as a worldview thing, has, pretty much been promoted by theists, I think. You atheists are all like this. It's sort of a cognitive shortcut so they don't have to think. And, I do a lot of debates where people will quote Dawkins or Harris, or they'll say, like, Sam Harris is a determinist. So, Shermer, how do you square determinism with this? Like, but I'm not a determinist.
Right.
Oh.
Right.
You mean you guys differ from each other? Yeah. we do.
Yeah, so that's why after I usually, like when I teach the atheism class, when I give the non-stamp collector idea, I'll say something like, so the way I define atheist is a person who doesn't believe there's sufficient evidence to warrant belief in God, but if he were or she were given the evidence, they would believe. Mm-hmm. And I think that nullifies a lot of the nonsense to come. Only Victor Stenger and such were just hardcore, like there was evidence against the stuff. He talked about that in actually a few of his books.
The God hypothesis, I think.
The God hypothesis, that's it. A little bit in the fallacy of fine-tuning too, but
I'm not sure I'm 100%. He changed my mind thinking about that a bit. If God exists, the universe should be a certain way. It's not that way.
Right.
That may be a test. I know Jerry Coyne agrees with that. To me, it seems it could be one of these Mysterian mysteries. Like there's no experiment we're going to run or set of data we're going to collect, and we go, look, there it is. 95% confidence level that God exists, or something like that. Because this is, my thought experiment that any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence would be indistinguishable from God. Right. Something like a technology like what we have, technological civilization. Just extrapolate that forward 50,000 years or 500,000 years, and you could create life forms, probably geoengineer planets and so on, the kinds of stuff we attribute to gods. So anything you would throw out at me is like, well, that little thing right there, that would be evidence of God. It's like, yeah, but a far future human or AI is going to be able to do that.
See, I didn't know that. So were you the one? Did you come up with that? I didn't know you came up with that.
Yeah, I wrote a Scientific American column called Shermer's Last Law. It was sort of a tongue in cheek. I was playing off of Arthur C. Clarke's famous 3 laws, the third one of which is any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so I just played on that and said any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence is indistinguishable from God. Same principle. So for example, the example I use is there's that quadriplegic who has a chip in his brain that allows him to move the cursor on a key on a computer, and he can turn on the music or pour himself a glass of water or whatever with the artificial hand just by thinking. Now, if you didn't know he had a chip in his brain, you'd think, well, this guy has telekinesis. Look, he just thinks the music and the music comes on. He thinks I want a glass of water and the water appears. But once you know that there's a chip in there, you think, oh, it's just technology. So, what do you think a God could do? I say to a theist, that any sufficiently advanced technology couldn't do.
Yeah, it can't answer the question. That's Krauss's idea. If you walk outside and the stars were aligned, I am God, believe in me. And that was my response. But now I'm going to quote it, attribute it to Shermer's last law, is you would have to be able to rule out alternative possibilities. You'd have to be able to rule out an alternative trickster culture or, admittedly, I would say, holy shit, like, I'm not supposed to swear.
Oh, no, it's okay. This is podcast. We can say anything we want.
All right, immediately I said, holy shit, that's something. But again, I don't know if that's sufficient evidence certainly wouldn't be sufficient evidence to warrant my belief. It might be sufficient to nudge me. So that's the other thing. It's like we start in society with the default of maybe. Like, well, come on. Like, maybe there are ghosts. Well, okay. Well, maybe there aren't. You need sufficient evidence to get to a maybe. And so we need to recalibrate our mechanism of belief formation, our epistemic humility, if you will. We have to recalibrate it toward the 1 or 2. You need evidence to even get to a 2, as opposed to saying maybe.
Yeah, like in terms of Hume's analysis of miracles, it's even worse now, because if you say, well, the limb regrows or this happens or that happens, that's just unbelievably improbable. First, I want to know, are Penn and Teller in the room, or is David Copperfield here? Right. Because these guys can make stuff happen that is truly miraculous. You've probably seen the commercial Penn and Teller did, where Teller's walking on water and he turns water into wine, and all the kind of stuff we think of as miracles, biblical type miracles. Any good stage magician can do. So again, just how do you know?
And the response to that, it's amazing the mental and intellectual gymnastics people have to do. The response to why doesn't God heal amputees among apologists is, if he did, then you wouldn't need faith.
Right.
Sorry to take an IQ point away from you from that. But that is an astonishing gymnastic that you have to perform to keep your belief system intact.
Yeah, I've heard him make that argument, of course, but then they're glad to give God credit when something else happens that they think was improbable, therefore God stepped in. So yeah, it doesn't really make any sense. Okay, continuing, let's move to the intermediate level. Let friends be wrong. I think this is super important.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit, but you don't need to correct everybody all the time about everything, which the marriage adage, if you can be right or you can be married. Is that what it is? So the idea that
I haven't heard that.
Sometimes you just have to let things go. And seeking ideological purity is one of our problems now. I mean, who really cares? I think I wrote in the book, got this from I held both of my parents' hands when they were dying, and who really cares, if someone's a different political tribe or part? What difference does it make? It doesn't really make any difference.
Right. Yeah. When I was growing up, my parents, one was a Democrat, one was a Republican, and they sort of joked about like, we're going to cancel each other's vote tomorrow, but it didn't lead to divorce.
That's another thing. Let me ask you real quick before we go into the techniques. When you were a kid, did your parents have friends of different political affiliations?
I think so.
Yeah, my parents did too. I see maybe it's because I live in Portland, but even among my friends, I've been asking that questions, and far more often than not, they say no. We don't know any. In my case, it's liberals. Like, we don't know any Republicans. We don't know it. That's a huge problem.
Big problem. Yeah.
And what was that Cushing and Dunning book, The Big Sort? We sort ourselves out according to tribes at this point, and it's easy not only online, but it's easy physically to do that as well. And then we segregate it in communities, and the problem with that is everybody's an other if they have a different belief, and that's a huge problem. It's again one of those things we're just not talking to each other.
Yeah, I remember I think it was 79 that Prop 13 passed in California. Property tax in California was 4%, which is huge, and so Prop 13 changed it to 1%. And I remember my dad was very glad about this because he had to pay property tax on his house, and that was a lot, because he didn't make that much money. But at the college I was at, professors were saying, I don't know anybody who's going to vote for Prop 13. No one's going to vote for this. This will never pass. And then, of course, it passed overwhelmingly because, in the academy, they're in this bubble where, no one's going to vote for that. Right. So if you don't know anybody that's going to vote for X, and half the country is going to vote for X, or half the state, then you're in a bubble.
Yeah, and I would also suggest you need to expand your circle of friends.
Yeah, how do you do that?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard if you live in a place like rural Oregon or even Portland. I don't really know how you do that. And I don't mean online friends. I mean actual people you sit down and have dinner with. I don't really know. I mean, find a hobby, talk to people.
Yeah, see, I think hobbies and sports. I mean, I run into a lot of people bike racing, just bike riding every day, because these are kind of just anybody who shows up at 8:00 at the Dolphins there at the pier in Santa Barbara. We just go ride, and it could be 10 people, 100 people, 5 people, whatever, and who knows what they believe. There's no sorting by beliefs, and so yeah, I get the political spectrum. So in that case, you kind of have to be careful. You can't make a Trump joke just in case there's somebody that's a Trump supporter, and there are. So.
It's interesting though. Even in jiu-jitsu, I found within this city, it's broken up tribally.
Really?
Yeah. So our mutual friend Matt Thornton, he has a gym, Straight Blast gym, and people with a certain type of mindset go there. And then there's other gyms, the kind of Antifa gyms, where people go there. So even then, you have to be careful because those groups are self-selected.
By the way, speaking of Antifa, I don't know if you saw Jeffrey Miller's podcast conversation with that Antifa member in Albuquerque.
Yes.
I mean, it was like he read your book. I mean, he followed the rules perfectly, and this guy just opened up. And Jeffrey was just super curious, like, well, how does it work? Or, what were you thinking when you were doing that? Or why do you guys all wear black? I mean, that's so interesting. Why do you do that? And this guy, because Jeffrey is such a sort of non-confrontational, soft-speaking guy. I mean, he follows a lot of your rules just by temperament, I think. Yeah. Friendly, open, curious. It's such that people want to engage with him. And this guy, just said, well, look, it's big fun to put on the uniform and get out there and mix it up and cause some shit with some of the Proud Boys. It reminded me a little bit on a sort of a side note of, part of the problem is that a lot of these young men, they're not gravitating towards sports. and the military is not cool to be in anymore, really. So what do? They're looking, high testosterone. They want to get out there and be physical and do something that, part of a band of brothers, and they're not into sports or whatever. They don't go into the military. So they end up finding some cause that they believe in. We're going to fight neo-Nazis and fascism. So I'm going to join this group, or the Proud Boys, same thing. And that seems to be a problem.
Yeah. So two things. Jeff Miller, I've spoken to him many times, but we never met in person. So that's on my to-do list next time. My wife's family's from New Mexico. He did a great job on that. And that, what you said, gets back to the morality and identity level salience, right? So they have a sense of identity. They have a sense of morality, the fascists, the Nazis, the Proud Boys, what have you. And then they walk into, and there's a whole line of literature on religious psychology in this, they walk into a morally supportive community, an ideologically motivated moral community. And all of those things, the suite of those factors, make beliefs difficult to revise. So I don't want to necessarily jump to chapter 7, but it does make, when someone believes, that's Dan Dennett's idea from Breaking the Spell, when someone believes they're a better person because they hold a belief, then you're in very, very difficult territory.
Yeah. Yesterday I was in conversation. Hang on. I'm trying to find the name of this book was Future Man. Do you know this book, Future Man?
No, it's a Netflix show or Hulu show.
Yeah, the guy, Tim, dialogued with him yesterday, and now it's escaping my failing memory, but basically it's sort of tracking the problem men are having today. Now, this was sort of a dicey conversation we had because a couple of white guys complaining about the world is, basically a lot of people, think, just shut the fuck up and let women have their say now. He's like, yes, okay, that's right. But on the other hand, men comprise, like 93% of prisoners, like 70% of suicides and so on. Yeah. I mean, and part of the problem he thinks is what I've just kind of articulated is that, young men need some cause. They need to belong to something, particularly that you can get out and be physical. So sports is a great outlet, but so he has a section on ISIS where he discusses what's the motivation for these young men to join ISIS. I mean, this is like one of the worst things you could possibly do, but for them, it's once you buy into the ideology, like we're fighting these evil satanic Americans, and the Jews or whatever it is they think they're fighting. Then, so Bill Maher always shows the funny videos of these guys on the monkey bars, like, haha, these idiots are out there training in the monkey bars, like this is a big thing. Well, but that's what young men want to do. They want to get out there and mix it up and train and become strong with their fellow brothers and then go fight some cause. And again, we're kind of still a little bit of a sidebar here on the subject, but this, recognizing what's behind what somebody is doing, why are they out there doing that? So, and to bring it back to your book, so if you're in Portland and there's the Proud Boys and the Antifa lining up, it's like your book is not really relevant. They don't want to talk; they want to fight. Right. I mean, they're not interested in having a conversation.
Yeah. So at that point, that's the other thing we talk about in the book is to know when to walk away, which is vital, and to know when not to engage internet trolls, which is increasingly becoming a problem. I've actually deleted my Facebook account because of severe harassment, which is actually one of the best things, such a time sink. But even on Twitter, and just the other day, someone impersonated me and they put up a fake account.
Oh, yeah, I saw that, yeah.
Yeah. But you have to know when to walk away, and you have to know there are some people you can have a conversation with, even if they're zealots and ideologues, and then there are some times where those conversations are dangerous. You just have to have the tools, which we talk about in the book, to figure out when to do that. And, you're not owed a response by anybody on social media.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed one tool is just ignore the people. Don't respond.
Yeah, I know. And that's really difficult for a lot of people to do. Yeah. People have to kind of...
I have a hard time doing it. It's like I get pissed off and I'm going to nail this guy. And then I'm like, what? Count to 10, walk away.
That's the Streisand effect, though. Every time, and people say the craziest stuff about me, but if I were to respond to those things, that would just raise that. It would just give them a voice. It would give them a platform, and then that would encourage more people to do that as well. So it's counterproductive. You just have to use common sense to figure out when to do that, which is more often than not at all.
Yeah. So in terms of your one of your key points of what's your goal in having the conversation, if you talk to an Antifa member or Proud Boys and say, let's all sit down and find some common ground, their response is probably going to be, we don't want to have common ground. We want to kick these people's ass. And that's the point of why we're here. So I think that's right. You have to walk away.
Yeah.
All right. Be willing to change your mind on the spot. So, so how do you do it? When you just say, look, I'm willing to change my mind, make the argument for me or something like that? Or?
No, I've done this before in conversations and people have been absolutely flabbergasted. So I think that we put that in the expert skills. I can't remember, but it's certainly much later in the book. So the book goes from difficulty. It's fundamental, beginner, intermediate, advanced, expert, and master.
Right.
And each of those increase in difficulty. And change your mind on the spot is, I had to habituate myself to do this. If I'm in that Rappaport's rule stage of really trying to understand what someone believes, listening, and then repeating it back to them. And if something they said I didn't know, I'd say, well, I didn't know that. I was just in a conversation. I did an Impossible Conversations series with someone. Now I'm going to get 5,000 emails of hate saying this, 10,000 tweets that I'm a bastard Nazi fascist. But I was speaking to somebody who was pro-life, and we were inevitably, as these discussions go, talking about how to define life. And she said something that I never considered before, and my immediate philosophical training was to hit counterexample. But instead, I used a technique in the book, and I changed my mind. And what she said is that if you were to go out in outer space somewhere and find some asteroid, the Japanese just land, or whoever lands whatever rover or something on an asteroid, and you were to take back samples, and you found. He just got surgery. Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah, I saw your tweets about your dog. There he is.
He's walking away. He's walking on his own now. It's pretty
good.
But, anyway, if you were to find that, and the soil sample showed that was carbon, and it was sufficient so that independent observers agreed that that's life, you would say that that's life. So why is that any different from a fertilized egg? Like if you were to find a fertilized egg in space, you'd be like, oh my God, that's life. And I thought to myself, it gave me the Greek aporia, wonder. And I thought to myself, you know what, if I really want to be honest with myself rather than just defending a previous belief, I would have to say, you're right, I never thought about that. I've changed my mind on that.
Yeah.
And her reaction was rather startling. Because people don't do that, especially in real time. And the other thing is, I can think of no better rapport builder than that.
Yeah.
To just be completely sincere and honest. And if someone says something you didn't know and that changed your mind, just acknowledge it. It's extremely hard in real time. And that's the other thing from hostage negotiations is that, in the literature on communications, is that you want to build bridges. You want to always allow people to save face. But if you can get over that idea of saving face on your part, you want to build bridges and allow other people to save face. But if you can just say to someone right in the middle of I honestly never thought about that before. I think I got to think about it, but that might have changed my mind. That's an amazing rapport builder, and people will respect you. They'll be utterly blown away by it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also shows you're listening to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Instead of just waiting to make your next point, which is important. Yeah,
you're a sincere inquirer too.
I use that with on the abortion issue. I last 2 years or so have taken up to showing my students Ben Shapiro videos on his pro-life arguments.
I cannot even fathom the consequence for me if I did that.
Well, most of my students are pro-choice, and they're first-year students, and I'm teaching them how to have these kinds of conversations and how to be open to other arguments and so on. But I also make the point about the free speech point that John Stuart Mill said, he who knows only his own position doesn't even know that. So if you're pro-choice argument, you're strongly pro-choice, and I say, well, what do you think the pro-life arguments are? Well, they just hate women. No, that is not one of their arguments. Try to think of something else. And
See, that's a version of the unread library effect, and it's the idea that what's the best argument against the position? So even saying that causes people to think, or tell me two people who, again, you have to calibrate this to the person with whom we're speaking, but tell me two people who really articulate good arguments against that point, and what are they? Most people have no idea.
Yeah.
They couldn't possibly tell you. Some people will, and in that case, it's great. You got a good lesson, right? You learn something.
I think a lot of it on those particular issues, they're not resolvable through conversation or debate. Because they're say in this case, conflicting rights. I believe in the rights of the woman. I recognize that a fetus is not just a tissue. It is a human. It's not legally a person until the third trimester. So, for example, if a woman is murdered and she has a fetus in the third trimester, it's a double homicide, right? So make a distinction between a human from a biologist point of view and a person from a legal point of view. Making that distinction helps people go, oh, okay, I see. I'm thinking of it this way and you're thinking of it that way, and we may never resolve it because we're just talking about it at different levels.
Yeah, so that works. My own belief, and we could unpack this if you want, is that it is possible to hierarchically prioritize competing rights. And I think that there are existing tools in the philosophical literature like John Rawls' theory of justice that enable us to do that. And there are mechanisms by which we can adjudicate those claims. But in order to have that discussion with someone, they have to be more educated and thoughtful to begin with. So you wouldn't use any of the big words I just used.
Yeah. No, I do use Rawls's ideas a lot in kind of rephrasing because it is a good tool. But the point here is just to acknowledge that there are differences to the other person you're talking to. That I'm open to what you have to say, although we could be speaking at different levels, and so we're not going to resolve this. Or like free will and determinism. Well, what do you mean by volition and free will? Because everything is going to turn on how you define those terms, and if we're defining them differently, then we're not going to resolve it through conversation or debate or anything else. To me, it seems like there's a lot of issues like that. I largely think like a lot of moral issues are resolvable through facts, just more correct facts, but some of them aren't. Like, for example, if you're in favor of a flat tax, I'm in favor of a regressive tax, and this guy over here is in favor of a progressive tax. There's no way to find out which is the right answer. It depends on what the goals of the society are. We want to do this or we want to do that. We want to encourage more profits in business, or we want to help the people that have fallen through the cracks. It depends what we're talking about. And there, I think acknowledging that it's not resolvable, but we can have a friendly conversation about it helps.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in those cases, too, one of the things we talk about in the book is to take a lesson from Socrates and always orient your conversation along the lines of a specific question. And you can move in and out of questions and change questions, but it helps you keep focus. It helps other people who are listening to the conversation focus in and be potential contributors too. So focusing on a question, defining words up front, like some words are notoriously slippery like faith, or now the word woman actually. And so having making those definitions up front.
Yeah, right. Okay. Faith. I like your definition. I think is thinking you know something when you don't. Was that how you defined it, or?
Yeah, pretending to know things you don't know, or there are a lot of John Loftus calls that an irrational leap over probabilities. There are so many, but it's very difficult now when we've made this subjective move to turn away from objectivity and towards subjectivity. And, we see that in standpoint epistemology, the idea that there's somehow a primacy in your lived experience. And without complicating it too much, the more oppression variables you have, the more you clearly see reality. So we have additional impediments to conversations. When you said before you were talking to someone, it's like two white guys complaining to each other. How do you have there's a section in the book in which something I've heard more than once now at Portland State University, if a white man told me 2 + 2 = 4, I wouldn't believe him. So how do you have conversations with such rampant identity politics and so conspicuous, so unabashed as well?
Yeah.
So we talk about, that's in chapter 6, that's actually my favorite chapter in the book.
Oh, 6 expert skills to engage the closed-minded. Yeah. Synthesis, help vent steam. What's that? Help venting steam. Oh, emotional roadblocks. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes people, often when people ask a question, they don't really want to know the answer. Maybe they ask because they want you to know they're listening. Maybe there's an attractive member, someone they want to date. So you don't really know why, and so they're just, maybe they want you to know that they know, so that's why they're asking the question. So you don't really know, but sometimes people just want to talk and be heard, and letting people vent steam. That's why we put it in the advanced skill. We talk about exactly how to do that, techniques from hostage negotiation, like I hear you, and really sincerely listening, and not, only following the first two rules of Rappaport's rules, listening and asking back, but not refuting or. So that's part of it. The other thing is very, very, I don't really know any manuals. So it was amazing to me in my first book, all of so much literature, videos, etc., about how to talk people into faith. Nobody ever wrote a book about how to talk people out of it. And then what was so striking to me about this is nobody really wrote a book on how to truly intervene in someone's cognitions and instill doubt, and how to do that across divides, and how to, synthesizing these vast bodies of literature. But then I really thought to myself, well, what do you do if someone wants to intervene in your beliefs? And so that's part of chapter 6. We talk about what do you do? And there are three things you can do. The thing that we most recommend is that you should just go for it. You should let those individuals attempt to intervene in your beliefs. And if they do so and you become more humble about something you thought, it's only a good thing. And some of that was a reaction to street epistemology, because many in the Christian community and the evangelical community in particular, and in the Muslim community, they were livid about this idea that you would talk to people and ask targeted questions to help them really ask themselves if they know what they think that they know. But why not go for it? You'd go for it with anything. You'd certainly go for it with empirical questions. So why wouldn't you go for it with moral or epistemological questions?
Yeah. I try this technique that sometimes work debating with, atheists and people of faith, is something like, if everybody in the faith community was like you, I wouldn't be worried about it. I wouldn't even bother with any of this stuff. I'm worried about the people that fly planes into buildings and blow up abortion clinics, and, who are driven by these beliefs. And, right. And therefore you take them out of, you're not one of the bad guys, you're one of the good guys. Right. But that's
also in the book. Sorry, I think there's a lag. Yeah, that's also in the book as alter casting. And we almost right. put that in there because we describe it as ethically murky. It's maybe almost bordering on unethical, is you cast somebody in a role and then they live up to that role. And we advocate two methods of alter casting. One is to, you really seem like the sort of person who's good at discussions and can have civil discussions. And so then they live to that role. And then the other one is you just take their favorite solution off the table. But like an example of alter casting is if you say to someone, oh, wow, you're really fast texter. Then you've cast them in the role of fast texter, and then they want to text quickly to show that they can live up to that role. So we almost didn't put it in there because you could cast people in negative roles as well. But it's a remarkably effective technique if the conversation's getting right before it starts to get heated.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of these are, I guess, must just come from experience where you don't have to think, step 3 or whatever. But the hostage negotiations, I really found that section super interesting. I mean, it's unlikely any of us or anyone listening to this podcast is ever going to have to do this, but what can we learn from what hostage negotiators do, and what do they do?
Boy, so I listened to a lot of transcript, a lot of record audio, and I read a lot of transcripts, and then I read and my co-author James Lindsay did as well, a lot of material on this, and we synthesized it into, 10 points or so. One of them I already said is try to elicit that's right. Use of minimal encouragers. It's a way to communicate back to let people know you're listening. There are so many small things, and again, obviously I hope no one is ever in that situation, but if they are, these are very simple techniques to use that cost you literally nothing. I don't have page numbers on mine, so I got to hear
like the person says, I'm just so sick and tired of people pushing everyone around and trying to get their way. And you say, get their way? And right. This kind of opens the door like, please tell me more.
Yeah. So that gets back to the idea we talk about in the book that's from hostage negotiations. This is a vital technique about calibrated questions. So calibrated questions don't, do you think this is true? That will just lend itself to a yes or no. But how questions and why questions are calibrated because they don't lend themselves to yes or no's. So they give you more to latch onto. So it's very difficult to intervene. It's possible to intervene in someone's cognitions with yes or no's, but it's much better, their beliefs, or have those kinds of conversations that are very difficult. It's much easier if you have something to latch onto and you keep talking to them, and that you keep the conversation flowing.
Yeah, I like this one. Allow the person to save face. That's super important. Build a golden bridge. What do you mean by that?
That's basically safe phasing. Saying things like, boy, I had that exact set of beliefs, and then I found this out. So
right.
You're like, yeah.
I do that a lot. I do that with, and I do it honestly. When I'm talking to climate deniers, I'll say, back in the 90s, I was right there with you. I totally thought it was all a bunch of bullshit. Remember when I was in college in the 70s, they said, overpopulation, the rainforest is going to be gone, peak oil, it's all going to come to an end. It's, the world's going to be, just terrible by 2000, and it never happened. So I thought, oh, come on, this is a bunch of bullshit, So I totally get why you think that, but then, I started reading this and I started thinking that, and some more evidence came through, and I kind of walk them through how I went from their position to my position.
You just built a golden bridge.
That's the bridge. Right. It
gives them an opportunity to save face. And we put in the book, don't put a toll on the golden bridge. Like, sometimes people, if you think they're starting to change their mind, or they've been reflecting on it, God, it took you long enough.
Right. I get that actually on the climate thing, because I think my article in Scientific American was like 2006 or 7, where I said I flipped on climate change, and
right.
A lot of people said, well, good, thanks. That was brave of you. But most people said, what took you so fucking long, Shermer?
Right.
Idiot, ideologue, and so on. Even when I wrote a column saying, my previous libertarian position has not really served me too well.
I remember that.
Yeah. So, a lot of people say, well, that was brave of you. That was courageous and intellectually honest. But a lot of people, it's like, just really upbraided me for that. Like, how could you have been so stupid to ever think that was the right position? It's like,
right. Okay, and so I just heard an episode of the most recent episode, Caitlin Flanagan, I think her name is, I can't remember, but she talked about how we've created a culture in which saying you're sorry for something is like any kind of admission of guilt like that, you get canceled. You're subject to cancel culture. There's no coming back.
Yeah.
It's such a dysfunctional time right now, and it seems, as Haidt and others have said, you can really pin it to the last 5 years.
Yeah.
The whole social dysfunction has started, and I think it exacerbated under Trump.
Yeah, that's made it worse. Yeah, a lot of what we're going through now, I do wonder, because people are describing it like it's this trend that's been building for years, and now here we are. Had Hillary won, which could have easily happened just by the quirkiness of the electoral system, the electoral college system, would people be saying, boy, things are bad, and, Hillary is just a blip on the good side? No, it would be like, well, we had our first black president. Now we have our first woman president. Things, in other words, moral progress is continuing as it has been for centuries. I do think there's kind of a lot of hindsight bias that, okay, so Trump won. Now, look, the pattern has been building for years. Well, has it? In other words, is this a long-term trend, or is it just a little blip in what we're experiencing?
Oh.
Well, it's sort of a rhetorical question.
I know it's because there's no way to answer it, so that's why I didn't say anything.
Yeah. How to converse with so master level, how to converse with an ideologue. This is really hard, because here you're not just talking about like, I have a position on abortion and yours is different, or tax rates or something like this, but with an ideology. Jonathan Haidt makes this point about, these moral foundations that people hold, or the point I always make when you're debating a creationist or a theist, if you say you have to choose between Jesus and Darwin, well, guess who's not going to be picked, because Jesus represents a whole worldview and Darwin's just a guy, a scientist. Right. So you have to take the ideology out of the equation and just say, look, we're just talking about this one little thing right here. I always say something like, maybe evolution was God's way of creating the diversity of life. So you can keep your God if you want, because they're not going to give that up.
Yeah, and that chapter was that's the culmination. And if you listen to the audiobook or folks read the book, we urge people not to jump ahead in any of the book or skip sections if they think they know it all, because they really all build on each other. And once you become really proficient in these techniques, it's not like you're using one or two, you're just interweaving them together. And chapter 7 builds on Haidt's moral foundation theory. It builds on just really, really, truly diverse types of literature and applied epistemology, moral epistemology. So epistemology is how you know what you know, and morality is what you should do. And it's moral epistemology is just the combination of those. How do you know what you should do morally? And most people, they don't have a pathway. They don't have clear pathways because their moral mind overrides their rational mind. And so that they have all these moral beliefs that they've worked from either backwards, or they've, desirability bias or confirmation bias. And so it is a very, very tricky business to navigate that. But those, to me, I've always found those to be the most interesting conversations personally.
Yeah, I remember a public talk I gave at a Canadian university, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago. And my Canadian buddy was there with me, Greg. And it was just my general why people believe where things talk. And in the Q&A, a professor was there, and he stood up and he went on and on about 9/11 truthism and the Bush administration and, the Building 7. And he had all these very specific things, and I could address most of them. But then my buddy he kind of intervened a little bit and said, okay, what is it that you're really after? What's bugging you? I mean, is it really Building 7 or what's behind this? This was after when the guy came up and we were just talking. And it had nothing to do with 9/11. It was, capitalism has corrupted civilization. There's too much greed and graft and
right.
And so in other words, 9/11, and this was just the tip of the iceberg. That the Bush administration is doing all these bad things over here, and this is just something I'm going to focus on for the moment. So he was really bothered by was private ownership of land, corporate greed, the profit motive. That's what he was on about.
And so what's interesting there is that those beliefs appeared to be held on epistemological grounds, right? Well, what about this building, or what about this fuselage? But so there's no data points that you can give somebody for moral beliefs like that. So their beliefs are really held. They're actually held for moral reasons, not epistemological reasons, but you're answering the epistemological reasons doesn't get to the core, which is the moral reasons, which is why you have to look toward moral epistemology to answer those questions. And then even within that, this is so complicated, even within that, that's why we try to break it down in the book, to just give people a very strict template, like literally, you say this, you say this, you say this, you say this, and to make it as straightforward as possible, because when someone holds their beliefs for moral reasons, those conversations are invariably more difficult, but I wouldn't say almost all, most beliefs, a surprising number of beliefs are held for moral reasons and not on epistemological or empirical grounds.
Yeah. Remember when I dove into the whole GMO controversy to write about it for Scientific American, it wasn't long before I realized this really isn't about GMOs. This is really about, because Monsanto kept coming up every article I ever read. Monsanto. It's like, this is really about corporate greed and charging for something that seems natural. Like, how can Monsanto own or patent a life form and then charge these little farmers, every season, and they're not allowed to, breed the seeds or whatever farmers do, and that Monsanto's after them. So it was really came down to, corporate greed and capitalism, and that's what was behind that. So arguing like, well, but GMOs feed poor people, or, golden rice, or, there's no evidence that it affects human health. Well, maybe it does, but it also affects the environment. But all that was like secondary. Behind that was there's something deeper wrong with Western civilization, and this GMO thing is just emblematic of the problem with capitalism.
Yeah, and this is the most counterintuitive thing in the book, and this is a heresy in the circles in which we travel, but it is borne out by the evidence over and over again, as I'm sure you're familiar with the backfire effect. We advocate not providing evidence, not offering evidence unless you're explicitly asked to do so, and only then.
Right.
And I know that seems so counterintuitive, but the literature is crystal clear. People do not change their beliefs on the basis of evidence. So it doesn't matter if they did, like you said, with the climate change and different political parties, that wouldn't happen. It'd be more like a pointillism painting, right? People with beliefs wouldn't correlate to anything, but yet that there'd be some clear picture in aggregate.
I like this tweet you have from Thomas Sowell. One of the most pathetic and dangerous signs of our times is the growing number of individuals and groups who believe that no one can possibly disagree with them for any honest reason.
Right, right. And that's the other thing we talk about in the book is we're in a crisis now where everybody assumes that everybody else has poor motivations.
Right.
As opposed to just thinking, again, like the Theaetetus, Plato's Theaetetus, that they just don't have a piece of information, but walking that line of offering that information, which is a mistake, but yet asking them the disconfirmation questions. Okay, what evidence could I provide you with? So you're not providing them with the evidence because the evidence that persuaded you might not be the evidence that persuaded them. Right? So you're asking them what it would take, right, and then seeing that, and then even then it's broken down further. There is no evidence. If someone says, well, there is no evidence, then the response to that is, then that belief is not held on the basis of evidence. Because to hold the belief on the basis of evidence, by definition, means there must be some evidence that could come in that would cause you to revise the belief. And that's why I couldn't not only sign the statement of faith, but the statement of non-faith.
Right.
Because I hold my beliefs on the basis of evidence. And so that's the first thing. And then someone could give a wildly implausible disconfirmation condition. And since we've been talking a lot about atheism, one would be the bones of Christ. What would cause you to deny the resurrection of Jesus? Well, the bones of Christ, because then he couldn't have ascended to heaven. So everybody knows that you cannot supply someone with the bones of Christ. But what's interesting about this, I talked about this, I think in 2012 at my Freedom from Religion conference, is that if you did present someone with the bones of Christ, they would do everything that they could to show that those were not the bones of Christ. They'd take them to specialist universities, etc. But that shows you that there's not a global problem with their thinking, right? Because if there was, they wouldn't know to do that. Their thinking is damaged in one particular area. And again, it's the idea that the moral mind is conflated or has it overrides the way they rationally process problems. So there you go again, the three things for disconfirmation. Well, here's the evidence it would take, and they tell you, and then you see if you have the evidence. Those are usually pretty civil conversations. There is no evidence, and then you do what I said about whether the belief's not held in the basis of evidence. There are only so many things that people can say to that, yes, no, or maybe. And then they offer a wildly implausible disconfirmation condition.
I was at a conference with Richard Dawkins and Ken Miller. There was a bunch of other speakers too, but Ken Miller is a Catholic, and he accepts the existence of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and that Jesus died for our sins. Now, he is also one of the leading biologists who debunked the intelligent design creationists. And so he's written several books about this, and he kind of makes this shift from empirical scientists to that's my faith tradition. And I remember Dawkins was asking him, okay, what if we found a piece of the true cross? It's really the true cross. And on it, there was a little bit of flesh, and we could extract some DNA. And what do you think the DNA of Jesus would be? Because, of course, he's born of a virgin and it doesn't have a biological father and so on. And Ken was like, this is not the level that I believe on. I'm not claiming I know empirically that Jesus existed and was resurrected and so on. It's my faith tradition, or it's just what I believe sort of metaphorically. He's not super clear about that, I think, or maybe I'm not remembering it, how he said it exactly. But it's a little bit like in my discussions with Jordan Peterson, where he talks about, if you say, Shermer, do you believe in God? I say no. And, Jordan, do you believe in God? Well, it would take me 40 hours to answer that. Okay. Well, how can it take that long? Because I'm talking about the metaphor of God or was Jesus really resurrected? Well, we all have our cross to bear because life is hard and we have to, forgive ourselves or others, whatever. So I think, if you're speaking at two different levels, what do you mean by true? metaphorically true, empirically true. And that example of Dawkins and Miller, they're just really talking about two different things. Now, for me, it's not acceptable to just say, well, that's my faith tradition. I just want to believe. But I have plenty of friends that are like that. Martin Gardner, famously, I don't know how much you know about Martin Gardner, but he was one of the early founders of the modern skeptical movement. Himself, James Randi, Paul Kurtz, Ray Hyman, and a few others founded the Psychop, now CFI, Skeptical Inquirer. This is in the 70s when Uri Geller was very popular. Any case, and then all the New Age movement, the astrology, psychics, all that stuff, and they were great, just debunking all these crazy claims. But then in the 90s, Martin kind of made it clear, well, I'm a fideist, along the lines of William James and who's the Spanish guy, Unamuno, the Spanish philosopher, that with certain beliefs that cannot be determined one way or the other. And the two big ones are God's existence and free will determinism. It's okay to make a leap of faith if it works for you pragmatically, if it affects your life in a positive way. This was William James's argument, and then so Martin Gardner kind of adopts this. And it was an interesting response because the skeptical community, atheist community, they love Martin Gardner for all the debunking he did. But it's like, wait, you believe in God? Yes. Well, why? I don't know. Just I don't have any good arguments for it. I think the atheists have slightly better arguments than the theists have, but it works for me. And I pray, and I think maybe there's an afterlife, and I believe in free will, and so on. I can't defend any of it. So the question is, what do you do with that? And one answer is nothing. There's really nothing to do with it. It's like kind of the end of the conversation. It's like, okay. Because in a way, when you say it's just my belief, I can't defend it, it's kind of a way of just sort of closing the conversational door, saying, well, then there's nothing more really to discuss.
Yeah, I guess it depends what your goal is. You can let friends be wrong. You can try to induce doubt, and I guess it just depends what your goal is. Increasingly, as I get older, I don't know. That's Harris's idea that those in the middle give cover for the extremists, and I think that there is something to that. Were you friendly with Martin Gardner?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I liked him very much and respected him very much, and even that position. Again, I wasn't upset about it. It's like, well, okay, but the arguments for the atheists are stronger, right? That's what you just said. Yeah. Then why aren't you an atheist? Because, I just don't want to be. And all right. It's kind of the end of the conversation. I just chose to let friends be friends. And that's it.
There's something, though, that is more honest about admitting that than saying, well, I think that the evidence is persuasive when the evidence is not persuasive.
Yeah.
So there's something more honest about, well, it gives me comfort, or I just choose to believe this, or I'm still not sure why the default would be, if you don't know, to choose to believe. I don't know a lot of stuff, but I don't choose to believe it. But it just depends on your goal and the kind of relationship you want to have. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer.
Then another thing I was thinking when we were talking is we're talking on the day that the Jeffrey Epstein story about the cameras in the jail, two of them both failed. This to me was the tipping point on the conspiracy thing. I've been skeptical of the conspiracy thing. And it's like, there's a certain amount of, there's kind of a tipping point when you get to these kinds of issues that are very difficult to defend one way or the other. And so you take the default null hypothesis. It's not a murder. It's except the given explanation until something happens. Well, for the last 2 weeks, I've been tweeting out the video footage will decide. If there's a hallway and you see somebody walking up there and going into the cell, done. Obviously, there was a conspiracy to kill him, and if not, then not. Well, now the video camera doesn't work. Oh, great. So then I think it's reasonable to think, well, something else. Now we can't conclude murder, but we can conclude something very fishy is up.
Yeah, and that was the point to me that pushed me over too. And I didn't really understand why all these people were talking about, oh, I know it's a conspiracy or it's not a conspiracy. It seemed like an idiotic thing to talk about. Just wait until the tape comes out. Why even speculate? What's the point?
Right.
But when the tape came out, I was totally with you up until that point. Yeah. And then the tape came out and I'm like, wow. And then that changed my mind. And then you came out on Twitter after I had changed my mind, or maybe before, I don't know. Maybe I just didn't see it. And then I thought to myself, okay, this is really interesting because at what point do we change our minds about things? So in that case, we had no moral motivation. It wasn't related to our sexual or personal or social or psychosocial identity. We're just looking at it as an interesting cultural case, and it is a cultural case. It's social. But it's interesting, at what point do people change their mind? And both video cameras feeds being, going down or what have you, that was the thing that I said, okay. More often than not, what's the most likely thing for this vast confluence of things? Okay, now it's something powerful.
Well, Pete, I want to be mindful of your time, and I have to sign off here at the studio. So again, congratulations on the new book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. Great read, super useful for everybody. And so thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Michael. I really appreciate it, and I have nothing but sincere admiration. You were the person who got me into skepticism and critical thinking and rationality to begin with. So I'm
okay. I hope that's a good thing.
That's a great thing.
All right, Pete. Thanks for coming on. All right. Bye-bye.